All right. How you doing, guys? I just wanted to take a few minutes to talk through our journal entry question for the week. The scenario on whether or not you bust up the drug ring right now and save your informant, or you wait for the bigger fish, which could put him in jeopardy. Um, I was really impressed this week. Um, the reason I really love looking in the journal entries is because they're not influenced by any of your peers. It's completely your own thoughts, and I've just been thoroughly impressed with each of your journeys. As you know, started out in module one in the beginning with the software copyright um, scenario, all the way up until the this week's informant scenario, drug big fish, whatever you want to call it. So I just been very impressed uh, watching the growth and the critical thinking and the analysis and different perspectives from everyone. And what I did see from this week's scenario was just a kind of a variety ways of looking at it, but all of you understood uh, the differing theoretical approaches. The utilitarian approach versus the moral rights approach. All of you were able to articulate the differences in those approaches like it's second nature to you now. So I appreciated that. That was really great to see. But you also, just about you guys came to many different conclusions using utilitarian approach, which I thought was interesting. So I wanted to talk about that a little. Um, well, some of you talked about taking the utilitarian approach. You could essentially say that the ethical thing to do would be to wait for the bigger fish and to allow your informant to be in harm's way, basically focusing on the happiness of the general population. If you're able to catch the ringleader and the happiness, the police department, uh, and comparing that to the happiness of the informant, his family in the drug ring, so that the greater amount of happiness, the group, more people will be happy if you catch the drug ringleader. So some of you were able to articulate that. Utilitarian approach could help you come to that conclusion, but others argue that the intensity and duration for the informant and his family, even though it's a smaller group of people affected, their intensity would actually counter the ability to say that it was ethical. So that was an interesting perspective, others, if you looked at the utilitarian approach and actually came to the same conclusion as if you use moral rights theory and you argue that the greatest amount of happiness will occur if you take care of the informant. Because the public will trust the police department and the police department gets more informants, perhaps to catch more criminals. So based on always putting the informant first, you may not be catching the criminal today, but you may be getting more assets for later. Because the more we do things as uh, the police department does things that gain the trust of the community, the more they're able to get better informants. So you may even have several of you suggested some creative ways of looking at this scenario where uh, you may decide to bust up the ring, right? You may decide to bust up the ring right now and save the informant, and even arrest everyone that's there, and including the informant, so that they don't know the difference between who he is and um, who he's not, trying to turn some of those people into informants as well. So you actually may have had a greater gain in that point. So some of you are able to actually look at the utilitarian approach from several different ways. And so I appreciated how you all looked at that through moral rights theory. And you were all in agreement that in order for us to look at this scenario, the only way we can do that ethically is to save the informant and put him first, because otherwise we're not treating him as an end in himself. Um, and we're treating him as a means to an end. So obviously, through moral rights theory, we should be treating people as having intrinsic value and as ends in themselves. Some of you also argue that perhaps looking at it from other theoretical positions that, for example, Aristotle, and most of you took a kind of like a blended approach to this, which is kind of what I expected. Nobody took a, one for one approach method to it, but most of you kind of looked at it as a blend. Um, and I was surprised to see most of you, so I should say pleasantly surprised, that most of you said for this particular scenario you would save the informant. And I know that might be a shock to others who said that they would, but the mission first, that they would put the mission first, but let me explain the differences. So for those of you that said you would still put the mission first, you made a couple of considerations. First of all, you don't know everything in this scenario. And so some of you said, well, if I had more information, and I know, for example, an informant is simply a kid that just, a young kid who was bored and decided to bring in some marijuana from Colorado and sell it to his buddy, and then he got caught. That would be totally different as it was would be if it was a known drug cartel member who has been connected to homicides and other things that you haven't been able to really get him for, but you know he's been associated with those things, and you know that might weigh into whether or not you protect that informant with everything you got, or if you kind of use him now, or if you kind of use him now. Most of you said it doesn't really matter because he still has intrinsic value, that he can be treated as a means to an end. But again, those are just considerations that some of you are looking at. So, they're all incredible arguments. So, another person said just simply looking at it from a Kantian approach, you have a duty to protect. A lot of you mentioned that as an intelligence officer, or should I say, a law enforcement officer, you have a duty to protect. You take the oath that says you will protect, and there are no exceptions to that. Your oath is that you will protect all that you can. So right now in this particular scenario, you just don't know the consequences, and so all you do know is if you act now, you can save a life. Uh, if you never had brought up that this whole scenario is not a ticking time bomb scenario, so where sometimes it's easy to get in the heat of the moment and say, well, if we lose this guy, we're going to lose the ringleader, and or we're going to go backwards, and all we've done is lost. It's easy to get caught up if that's the case. But the fact remains, if you catch this criminal today, you're probably going to have another opportunity to do it. So what's important right now is saving and protecting the informant, because that's your duty as a law enforcement officer, is to protect your informant. Uh, what others suggested or brought up was the fact that the longer you know, if you choose to put your informant in harm's way, and you say, well, he's getting into he chose to get into this, he agreed to do it to get out of a certain sentence, or, some sort of plea deal, or whatever reason, the fact remains he's also trusting that you're going to keep him safe. So if for some reason we can kind of apply the Turner test to this, for some reason, um, if something happens to this informant and word gets out, especially to the media, the greater amount of unhappiness is going to be on the entire police department. And in it, it permeates throughout all the police department, because if one thing happens in one sitting, sure enough, it gets talked about everywhere. Social media gets it out everywhere, and then, it hurts the entire reputation of law enforcement. So that's something you really have to consider when examining happiness and unhappiness. And I think going back to the ticking time bomb scenario, I wanted to make sure I um, covered it as thoroughly as possible. A big difference between drug missions and national security, when there's a bomb threat, is that there's a there's a state of consistency when it comes to drugs. There's always the war on drugs. We're constantly fighting the, the drug war, and by making exceptions, by allowing our informants to be put in harm's way, well, we're risking what Dr. Bellaby stated is, we're facing the idea of normalization. So if we make exceptions to catch one ringleader or another, and we put people in harm's way as a result of that, we run the risk of normalizing these kind of behaviors by the police department. And even if it happens just once, if we put an informant in harm's way and word gets out that, and the media gets a hold of that, the entire police department is now in jeopardy, and it's no longer trusted. And you lose more informants and many things like that. So that is not something that we want to be normalized. And the other part of that is when we're looking at the ticking time bomb scenario, there's a certainty that death will happen if we do not stop that from happening. So we might make exceptions in those circumstances. And I'm not saying we should or we shouldn't. Again, that can go back to normalcy or normalization, I should say. But with the drugs, the only thing we do know with certainty is that our informant is likely to die if we don't act. And therefore, it is our duty as law enforcement officers to protect. And under that duty, we need to act and save him because that is the one thing we do right now. And we do know, and that we can do. It doesn't mean, if you have experience, if you're working in law enforcement right now, from your personal experience, that if you wait a little bit longer and see what happens, that's okay. Absolutely. You have to use what you know as a professional to decide, well, maybe they're not in danger just yet, but if that ringleader shows up, then it's time. And I know it's okay to have a blended approach, but we can't look at a drug operation the same way as we look at a bomb about to go off because they're intrinsically different. And that's just one thing I want to make sure you take away from this scenario. Obviously, you have to make the best choice that you can, but I think that you put yourself in a position to get to fall for noble cause corruption if you allow yourself to say, well, I'm doing this for the greater good. I'm trying to save all these people from drugs, and so I'm going to put this guy in harm's way and treat him as a means to my ends. You have to be careful with that. So I'm not saying never do it, but I'm saying you definitely need to consider it and talk about it and train on it in your organization so that and everyone knows that the ethical way to deal with your informants, number one. And number two, what kind of impact that's going to have on your organization if it goes south. So thank you guys for a great job this week, and good luck this next week, and let me know if you have any questions.